What if everything you thought you knew about cowboys was a lie? What if the hero in the white hat riding across the plains to save the day wasn't a hero at all, but a carefully constructed fantasy? Ask yourself, why did Hollywood paint them as symbols of justice but never show who they were really working for? Why did the school books tell us about gunfights in dusty towns but skip the part about land grabs, hired killings, and stolen identities? Could it be that the myth wasn't just about entertainment, but about control? The truth is, the cowboy we've all grown up with, stoic, noble, white, was never meant to reflect history. He was designed to distract from it. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as the American frontier era ended, a new story was born, one crafted by dime novelists, showmen like Buffalo Bill, and later, the studios of Hollywood. They didn't want the public remembering a West filled with chaos, race mixing, labor unrest, and brutal conquest. They wanted a clean, heroic symbol of American grit. And so they created him, the cowboy, as legend. Clean-shaven or rugged, always brave, always white, always right. A man who stood alone against injustice. But that wasn't who most cowboys were. They were cattle hands, often poor, often brown or black. They worked under harsh conditions for wealthy employers. Many were drifters, some were criminals. They weren't shaping history, they were surviving it. But the myth sold, and more importantly, it gave the US something it desperately wanted: a masculine, rebellious icon that could stand tall while the truth was buried beneath boots, dust, and lies. And that myth, it still lives with us today, louder than ever. Behind every romantic tale of a cowboy riding into town to set things right lies a much darker truth. Many of these men weren't symbols of justice, they were enforcers of power. Hired hands not for the people, but for the cattle barons, railroad tycoons, and ruthless landowners who were expanding westward like a wave swallowing everything in its path. The cowboy's job wasn't just rounding up cattle, it was protecting territory, intimidating rivals, and sometimes using deadly force to silence anyone who got in the way. In range wars, they were armed soldiers fighting over land that wasn't theirs. During strikes and rebellions, they helped crush laborers demanding fair pay. And during the brutal expansion into indigenous lands, they were often on the front lines, not as defenders of liberty, but as pawns in a violent game of conquest. These weren't stories of honor. They were stories of hired violence dressed up in leather and dust. Cowboys didn't walk into saloons to deliver justice. They walked in to send a message from whoever signed their paychecks. Sometimes that message ended with fists, sometimes with bullets, and yet we were taught to admire them, taught that they were the good guys because they kept order. But whose order was it? Whose peace were they protecting? Certainly not the farmers forced off their land, not the native tribes erased from maps, not the workers buried in unmarked graves. There's a reason the cowboy myth endures, because it hides who had the power and how they used it. It gives violence a noble face. It lets America remember conquest as courage. But behind the spurs and six-shooters, many of these cowboys weren't heroes at all. They were mercenaries. And the people they hurt, their stories were never told. Until now. If you've only seen cowboys in movies, you'd think they were all white men with sun-scarred skin and deep voices, riding alone into the sunset like gods on horseback. But that image is a lie built on erasure. Historians estimate that at least 1 in 4 cowboys were black. Many were formerly enslaved people who turned to ranching after the Civil War because it was one of the few jobs where skin color didn't entirely shut the door. Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys, were doing this work generations before the US ever looked west. Native Americans too became skilled riders and wranglers, adapting to a world that had tried to wipe them out. These were real men with real pain, real skill, and real stories. But Hollywood cut them out. On purpose, they weren't seen as marketable, they didn't fit the myth being sold, the lone white savior taming the wild frontier, so they were rewritten, replaced, and in some cases completely erased. This wasn't just about film credits or casting, it was about identity, about memory. Because when you erase someone from history, you erase their pain, their resistance, their dignity. These cowboys of color shaped the West, they survived it, and in many cases they did the hardest jobs, took the greatest risks, and still got none of the credit. If the cowboy is supposed to be the symbol of American strength, then maybe it's time we face the truth that strength was never just white. It was black, it was brown, it was indigenous, and it was stolen from them. Violence in the Old West wasn't the exception, it was the norm. It wasn't just outlaws causing chaos. It was the towns themselves, the very people sworn to protect them. We like to imagine sheriffs standing firm for justice, but many wore their badges only after hanging up their outlaw hats. They didn't switch sides, they just changed uniforms. Gunfights didn't happen once in a generation. In some towns, they happened weekly. Over land, over cattle, over nothing but pride. Bar fights often ended with bodies in the dirt. Lynch mobs weren't uncommon. Vigilante justice replaced actual law, and in that world, fear was the real sheriff. Cowboys weren't noble warriors. Many were desperate men. Some were drunks, gamblers, fugitives running from something or someone. When they rode into town, it wasn't always to protect. Sometimes it was to collect or to destroy, and the people caught in the crossfire, innocent settlers, women, children, workers trying to hold on to a piece of something in a world where violence had become currency. But Hollywood made it look clean, like duels at high noon were acts of honor. That wasn't honor, that was survival. That was ego with a trigger finger. We've glamorized that violence for so long, we've forgotten what it really was. Chaos disguised as courage, pain wrapped in legend, and maybe it's time we stop calling it a legacy and start calling it what it was, a wound that never really healed. The cowboy wasn't just a drifter chasing cattle. More often, he was an enforcer for someone richer, someone pulling strings far from the dust and danger. Railroad companies, cattle barons, and land speculators hired cowboys to guard their interests and to remove anyone in the way. Homesteaders, native tribes, striking workers. If you stood between profit and expansion, the cowboy came knocking. We were told he was the face of freedom, but really he was a tool of control. The kind of control that fenced off open lands, forced families to flee, and turned conflict into business. His gun wasn't for justice, it was for ownership. It's uncomfortable to face, but necessary. The cowboy legend wasn't built on liberty. It was built on labor, blood, and obedience to power. And when we mythologize that role, we risk forgetting the people who were crushed under every hoofbeat, erased from every story. The cost of expansion was never told. Until now, the cowboy isn't just a relic of the past, he's still with us in our movies, our politics, even our personalities. That rugged individualism, that idea that one tough man can solve everything with grit and a gun. It still shapes how America sees itself. It's in how we idolize lone heroes, it's in how we downplay community and glorify confrontation. And it's in how we keep rewriting history to make violence look like virtue. But when you peel back the myth, what's left? Not freedom, but control. Not honor, but erasure. The cowboy legend became a mask for deeper truths about race, class, and conquest. And if we keep worshipping the myth without questioning it, we risk repeating its mistakes in new forms. It's time we saw the cowboy for what he really was and what he still represents. If this opened your eyes, don't scroll past. Like, share, and subscribe, because these stories aren't over. They've just been buried.